Ever heard of an engine so loud and strong that it got kicked off the road? That's the Detroit 8V92. It was fast, it was angry, and it didn't play by the rules. Let's break it down. The Detroit Diesel 8V92 came out in the 1970s as part of the Series 92 engine line. The name 8V92 means it had 8 cylinders arranged in a V shape, and each cylinder had 92 cubic inches of displacement. That made the whole engine about 12.1 liters, which is pretty big. This engine used a 2-stroke design, which was a bit unusual for road trucks even back then. Instead of the regular 4-stroke cycle that most engines use today, the 8V92 completed a power cycle in just 2 strokes of the piston. That made it very compact for its power level, but also a bit noisy and more complicated when it came to emissions. It needed a blower to help push out the exhaust and bring in clean air, since it did not have a dedicated exhaust stroke. Later versions added a turbocharger and aftercooler, which increased both power and efficiency. Without a turbo, the engine made about 360 horsepower and close to 1,000 pound-feet of torque. But when turbocharged and aftercooled, the engine could produce over 430 horsepower and more than 1,200 pound-feet of torque. That kind of power made it a favorite among truckers and bus drivers who needed serious pulling strength. Detroit Diesel first painted these engines green, but they had some early problems like cracked pistons and coolant leaks. So when they improved the design, they painted the new version silver. That is why many fans refer to them as the Silver 92s. The 8V92 quickly became a favorite in heavy-duty applications. It was used in big rigs, buses, military vehicles, boats, and even fire trucks. Drivers loved it for its strong torque and unique sound. Since it was a 2-stroke engine, it made a loud, high-pitched whine that earned it the nickname Screamin' Jimmy. You could hear it coming from a mile away. This engine pulled hard at low RPMs. That made it ideal for hauling heavy trailers up steep hills or moving loads across long distances. Some versions of the 8V92 were tuned for even higher power, reaching up to 475 horsepower or more. In some custom setups, it even pushed past 700 horsepower on a dyno. That was insane for a diesel engine of that time. Drivers also liked how the engine responded. You had to keep it in the power band, usually between 1,400 and 2,100 RPM, and that made driving it a bit of an art. It worked best when paired with manual transmissions like the Eaton Road Ranger. Shifting gears with one of these engines gave truckers a real sense of control and power. But for all its power and popularity, the 8V92 had some serious flaws. One of the biggest issues was reliability. The early versions had engine failures, which led to a lot of complaints. That is why Detroit had to redesign and repaint them. The silver ones were better, but even those needed regular maintenance. Another major problem was fuel consumption. The 8V92 drank fuel like crazy. Some drivers joked that it got 3 gallons to the mile, not the other way around. It also used a lot of oil. You had to run heavy single-grade oil, usually 40 weight, and using thinner oils could damage the camshaft or other moving parts. Overheating was another concern. If the engine was pushed too hard or not properly maintained, it could blow a head gasket or warp the cylinder liners. That meant expensive repairs. Mechanics would often warn drivers not to let exhaust temperatures get too high, or things would start melting inside the engine. But the biggest problem of all was emissions. By the 1980s and 1990s, governments started cracking down on pollution from diesel engines. The 8V92, with its 2-stroke design, just could not meet the new rules. It released too much soot, unburned fuel, and nitrogen oxides. There was no easy way to add a catalytic converter or particulate filter because the engine dumped oil and fuel into the exhaust. Detroit Diesel tried to improve the emissions with electronic fuel controls, but it was not enough. Even with those upgrades, the engine was still too dirty for modern standards. It became clear that the 2-stroke design was outdated and something had to change. By the mid-1990s, Detroit Diesel began phasing out the 92 series. They introduced a new line of engines called the Series 60, which used a 4-stroke design and had much better fuel economy and emissions. The Series 60 became one of the most successful engines in trucking history and quickly replaced the older 2-stroke models. In 1998, after years of pressure from environmental groups and government regulators, the two-stroke engines were officially discontinued for on-road use. They were not technically banned by a law, but they were no longer allowed in new vehicles because they could not pass emissions tests. Some 8V92s continued to be used in boats, generators, and off-road equipment for a while. But even in those areas, they were slowly replaced by newer, cleaner engines. By the early 2000s, parts became harder to find, and fewer mechanics knew how to work on them. Many of the old buses and trucks that used 8V92s were either scrapped or converted to other engines. The Detroit Diesel 8V92 was powerful, loud, and full of character, but it also belonged to a different time. Back when fuel was cheaper and emissions were not a major concern, the 8V92 made sense. It delivered brute force in a simple package. But as the world changed, the engine could not keep up. In the end, the Detroit Diesel 8V92 wasn't just an engine, it was a symbol of power, sound, and old-school diesel pride. It had its flaws, sure. It used a lot of fuel, needed regular maintenance, and couldn't keep up with modern emissions rules. But it had something special that made people love it anyway. The scream of the two-stroke engine, the raw pulling power, and the way it responded when driven right, it all made the 8V92 unforgettable. But even with all those problems, the 8V92 was still something special. It had its own style. The loud, high-pitched sound of its two-stroke engine made it easy to recognize. You could hear it coming from far away, and once you did, you wouldn't forget it. It was really powerful, especially at low RPMs, and it could pull heavy loads without any trouble. People who drove it, worked on it, or just watched it in action knew it wasn't just an engine. It was more than that. It was an experience, a reminder of the days when engines were loud, strong, and full of character. The Detroit Diesel 8V92 wasn't just an engine, it was an experience. Loud, powerful, and full of personality, it earned a place in diesel history despite its flaws. It drank fuel too much, needed frequent maintenance, and couldn't meet today's emissions rules. But the scream of that two-stroke, the low-end torque, and the way it came alive under pressure made it unforgettable. If you're into old-school diesel power or just love machines with soul, the 8V92 is worth remembering. And hey, if you've ever heard a Screamin' Jimmy in action, drop your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.